For more than a century, the tar pits of Los Angeles have been called a death trap that ate California's wildlife. They ate almost nothing. One large animal a decade built the whole deposit. So if the trap did not empty California, what did? Something the tar could only record. It began with a 30-fold rise in fire. To understand what emptied California, we must travel back to the sea that made the trap in the first place. Behind a low fence on Wilshire Boulevard, between an art museum and 6 lanes of traffic, there is a pool of something black. In summer it moves. Bubbles of methane push up through the surface, hold for a moment, and burst. Leaves drift onto it and stay where they land, and within a week you cannot tell where the ground ends and the pool begins. How deep does a death trap have to be? Not deep at all. A few centimeters of surface asphalt is enough to hold a full-grown cow or a horse. That is not a guess about the past. It still happens to modern animals that wander into the seeps. The Ice Age version was worse because it was hidden. Fallen leaves and wind-blown dust settled across the surface until it read as solid ground to anything walking past. It was also a machine with a switch. Surface asphalt only stays soft and sticky when the air is warmer than about 18 degrees Celsius. Below that, it stiffens, and the trap closes for the season. So this place never killed continuously. It killed in summer and in the warm centuries, and it went quiet in the cold ones. Which means the record it kept is not evenly spaced. It is a set of warm weather snapshots taken across 50,000 years, with gaps between them where the trap was shut. That is worth remembering, because almost everything in this investigation is built on what the seeps caught. And the seeps only caught things when they were warm enough to hold on. And the tar is older than everything it ever caught. Between roughly 18 and 5 million years ago, long before any of these animals existed, Southern California lay underwater. The crust here was rotating and pulling apart, opening a deep basin that filled with marine sediment until the pile stood 6 miles thick. A stack of dead sea floor taller than Everest, sitting under the suburbs. The richest layer in it is called the Monterey Formation, and it was built out of diatoms. Plankton, countless generations of them, buried, cooked under pressure, and turned into oil. That oil still climbs toward daylight along fractures beneath the city, including a break in the rock called the 6th Street Fault, and where it surfaces, it makes asphalt. The trap is made of plankton. The same Miocene sea left California a second death trap further north. Under the dry hills outside Bakersfield lies the Sharktooth Hill bone bed. a layer of bone between 6 and 20 inches thick, running beneath tens of square miles of farmland. It averages around 200 bones to the square yard. You could not put a hand flat on that surface without covering one. Among them are the teeth of a shark, some 40 feet long, about 12 meters, the length of a city bus. Both places are archives. Only one of them is still open for business. The asphalt at Rancho La Brea has produced around 3.5 million specimens from roughly 600 species, covering the last 50,000 years of Southern California. 3.5 million pieces of the Tth Ice Age out of a patch of ground you can walk across in 2 minutes. And it is still catching things this summer. So what does 50,000 years of a switched-on trap actually catch? The answer is a census that no living landscape on Earth could produce. It begins, as it almost always did, with one animal making one ordinary mistake. An ancient bison comes down to drink at the end of a hot afternoon. The ground at the water's edge looks firm, dusted over with leaf litter and blown grit. She puts her weight on it, and her forefoot does not come back up. She pulls and sinks to the knee. Within the hour, the sound she is making has crossed a mile of open country in every direction, and the animals that heard it are already walking toward her. By nightfall, several of them are standing in the same asphalt she is. None of them will be buried whole. They will be pulled at, scattered, worked over by everything that arrives afterward and manages to get back out again. Then the seasonal rivers will bring sand and gravel down across the seep, and the whole ruined scene will be sealed under it. That is the pattern the deposit preserves, and it produced a fossil record unlike any other on Earth. The majority of the large mammals excavated from Rancho La Brea are not plant eaters. They are carnivores. In any living landscape, a predator is the rare animal. Here it is the common one. What does that look like in actual animals? More than 4,000 dire wolves. More than 2,000 saber-toothed cats. More saber-toothed cats out of one city block than from the rest of the world combined. And the commonest large plant eater in the entire deposit, the ancient bison, is represented by around 300 individuals. Those are the numbers recovered so far from ground that is still only partly excavated, produced by a trap that switched itself on and off with the seasons for 500 centuries. And they are only the large mammals. The same deposits hold birds, lizards, snails, beetles, seeds, wood, pollen, and the insects that fed on the bodies while they lay there. Around 600 species in total, It is not a collection of monsters. It is an entire ecosystem dropped into black glue and left where it fell. The obvious reading of a census like that is that the pits were a slaughterhouse, steadily eating California's wildlife for 50,000 years. They were not. Work on how the deposit accumulated found that it takes remarkably little to build. One large plant eater, trapped roughly once a decade, with each of those events drawing in as many as a dozen predators and scavengers, is enough to account for the entire assemblage. One bad step every 10 years. Run that forward and the arithmetic stops being strange. Across 50,000 years, it comes to a few thousand bad afternoons and a few tens of thousands of animals that came to investigate them. Spread thin enough across that much time, it is not a massacre. It is a slow drip. That is a rate no population on Earth would notice. So the first suspect can be released. The asphalt is not the killer in this case. It is the witness. And it is an unusually good one. Asphalt does not just hold a body, it soaks into it, filling the pore spaces in the bone and locking out the oxygen and the bacteria that normally take a skeleton apart. What comes out of the ground is stained a deep brown and smells faintly of petrol, and it is often close to complete. It kept its notes for 50,000 years without missing much, and people have been reading them on the same spot since 1915, when a pit numbered 91 was opened and has been worked on and off ever since. Out of everything that has come out of that ground, exactly one human being has ever been found. A young woman, recovered in 1914, with a fractured skull and nothing to say about how she got there. But the witness's testimony is still impossible. No landscape on Earth is mostly predators. Plants feed more animals than meat does, and they always have. A basin that genuinely ran that way would have collapsed inside a single generation. So either Ice Age California was insane, or the trap is lying about something. It is lying, and the lie turns out to be the most useful thing in this entire investigation. The lie is in who answers a scream. Dusk over the basin. The bison has been standing in the same few square meters since the afternoon. And she has stopped struggling. Shapes are coming in across the open ground from three directions, low and unhurried. They are not watching each other yet. They are watching her. That is the bias, and once you see it, the census makes sense. A trapped, struggling plant eater advertises a free meal for miles in every direction. Anything that answers a distress call walks straight toward the one patch of ground in the landscape guaranteed to hold on to it. The trap never sampled Ice Age California. It sampled the animals that came running. The ratio is an artifact. The animals in it are not. Take the most numerous of them. For most of the last century, the dire wolf was filed as a heavier, blunter gray wolf, the same animal with the volume turned up. It was nothing of the kind. 5 genomes were sequenced from subfossil remains, some of them older than 50,000 years. They put the dire wolf on its own branch for close to 6 million years, with no sign of interbreeding with gray wolves or coyotes at any point in that time. It was not a wolf that got big. It was the last survivor of a separate New World dog lineage that had been running alongside the others the whole way. The name was changed to match, Enochion dirus. It shared the ground with a heavier crowd. Saber-toothed cats, between 160 and 280 kilograms, built thicker through the chest and shoulders than any lion alive today, carrying upper canine crowns around 18 centimeters long. As long as a human forearm from wrist to elbow. American lions a quarter larger again than the lions of Africa, the largest cats North America has ever produced. And overhead, waiting for all of it to be over, teratorns, with wingspans between 3.5 and nearly 4 meters, wider than a family car is long. Picture the queue at a single trapped animal. Dire wolves first, in numbers, then whatever cat is close enough to displace them. Then the birds, dropping in once the noise stops. Every one of those arrivals is a body the asphalt might keep, and every one of them is why the census reads the way it does. Which raises the obvious question about a landscape carrying that much appetite. Were they slowly starving? There is a way to test it. Microscopic wear on a tooth records what an animal was chewing in the last days of its life, and a predator under food stress starts cracking and swallowing bone, which scars enamel in a way nothing else does. Teeth from these carnivores were scanned across the final millennia of the deposit. The stress signal is not there. The American lion's wear pattern most closely resembles a cheetah, an animal that avoids bone almost entirely. That is not what a squeezed predator looks like. A carnivore running out of prey eats more of each carcass, not less. It cracks the long bones for marrow and swallows the fragments, and its teeth carry the record of having done so. These animals were leaving food on the ground. That clears something important. These predators were feeding well right up to the end. Whatever happened to California did not start at the top of the food chain and work downward. But the second suspect does not walk away clean either. A guild packed that tightly is a guild with no slack in it. Every one of those animals was a standing bet that the herds would stay exactly where they were. That is the quiet danger in a landscape this rich. Abundance at the top is not a sign of safety. It is a sign of dependence. A system that has converted that much grass into that much muscle has no reserve left over, and it does not degrade gently. It holds, and then it goes. They were fine until, very suddenly, they were not. So the question drops a level to the animals they were eating. They were, by any standard we have now, absurd. A Colombian mammoth comes down through the scrub toward the water. Over 4 meters at the shoulder, close to 9,000 kilograms. Twice the weight of an African elephant. It stops short of the edge and puts the tip of its trunk down on the ground, testing. Living elephants do this. They read a surface before they trust their weight to it. Whatever this one feels, it turns and takes the long way around. The landscape it was walking through was full of animals built to the same scale. Harlan's ground sloth, 3 meters long and around 1,000 kilograms. The weight of a grand piano with bony nodules set through its hide like gravel so that a bite closing on its back would find armor instead of muscle. Deeper in the record, there was something larger still. The giant bison stood 2.5 meters at the shoulder, weighed over 2,000 kilograms, and carried horns spanning more than 2 meters from tip to tip. Wider than a doorway is tall. That one was already gone by the end. It had been replaced, long before the final centuries, by the smaller ancient bison. The same animal that walked into the asphalt at the start of this investigation. Together, these were the engine of the whole system. Everything in the last chapter, every cat and every direwolf was running on grass and browse that had first been turned into several tons of walking meat by animals like these. We know this fauna as intimately as we do because of an accident of construction. In 2006, crews digging an underground car park for the art museum next door cut into fossil deposits nobody had mapped. One of them held a Colombian mammoth around 80% complete, the most complete ever recovered from the site. The crews named him Zed. Rather than excavate in place and stop the build, the deposits were cut out of the ground in blocks, crated, and moved a short distance across the property. 23 crates of Ice Age California. They are still being worked through today. It is a strange way to run a dig, and it produced something valuable. Because the blocks came out intact, the animals inside them are still lying where they fell, in the positions they died in, next to whatever died with them. Most fossil sites give you a list of what lived somewhere. This one gives you afternoons. So was being enormous the fatal flaw? Partly, and in a specific way. An animal that size breeds slowly. A mammoth carries a calf for close to 2 years and then raises it for a decade. A population running on that schedule cannot absorb a bad century because it cannot replace its losses fast enough to outrun them. Whatever margin a rabbit has, a mammoth does not. But that argument proves too much, because these animals had already been tested. The radiocarbon dates from the deposit cluster in warm interludes, which means the trap kept switching on and off as the climate swung back and forth through the last glacial period. The basin had warmed and cooled more than once inside this record. And after every one of those swings, the same giants were still walking into the same seeps. That is the test any explanation has to pass from here on. Whatever emptied California has to be something that had not happened before. In 50,000 years of a record that was watching the whole time. So the third suspect is guilty of something, but not of this. Size explains why they were fragile. It cannot explain why they died in one particular century, and not in any of the earlier warm intervals sitting in the same ground. The weakness had been standing in that landscape for tens of thousands of years, waiting for something to find it. So what finally found it, and why then? The answer begins about 14,000 years ago, and at first it does not look like a weapon at all. It looks like good weather. The same basin, centuries on. The oak and juniper are still standing, but there is more space between them than there used to be. The grass comes up thinner each spring and cures browner each summer. Streams that ran all year now stop in August. And the seeps stay soft further into the autumn than they ever used to. That detail matters more than it sounds. The trap runs on heat. A warmer basin is a basin where the asphalt spends more of the year able to hold an animal, which means the record itself gets richer at exactly the moment the world it is recording starts going wrong. Between about 14,000 and 13,000 years ago, the whole planet ran unusually warm and dry. In Southern California, average air temperatures rose by close to 6 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not a warm decade. That is a basin moving a full climate zone without going anywhere. None of this would be readable without one specific piece of work. In 2023, a study ran 172 new radiocarbon dates through megafauna bones taken from the deposit itself, covering the stretch from about 15,600 years ago down to 10,000. That is what changed this case. Before it, the tar pits were an enormous heap of Ice Age animals, with only a loose sense of when any of them had died. Everything was true in general and vague in particular. Afterwards, they were a timeline. You could ask when each species stopped turning up in the asphalt and get an answer with a date attached to it. That single change is the difference between a museum and an investigation. 8 large mammals were tracked through it: saber-toothed cat, dire wolf, American lion, ground sloth, horse, bison, camel, and coyote. 8 lines running down the page toward the present, and the question was simply where each of them stopped. So, what does 1,000 warm, dry years do to a woodland? It cures it. Oak and juniper give ground to low, resinous scrub that does better on heat and thin soil. Dead fuel builds up faster than it can rot away. Nothing about it looks like a catastrophe. It looks a little browner, a little more open, a little more like the California anyone would recognize today. And for the animals, the change is not obviously fatal either. A mammoth that needs several hundred kilograms of vegetation a day does not care what the vegetation is called. It cares how much of it there is, and how far apart the patches sit. Both of those numbers were moving slowly in the wrong direction. What it has quietly become is a landscape that will carry fire. And this is where the investigation wants to stop. It is tidy. The climate warmed, the world dried out, the giants could not cope, and they died. Case closed, and it even sounds responsible. It does not hold. The same deposit records earlier warm interludes, and the same animals are still in the ground on the far side of them. And there is a timing problem that no amount of climate will fix. The warming is a slow trend spread across 1,000 years. The extinction, when it finally arrives, is over in barely 200. Slow causes do not produce sudden effects. Something else had to happen, and it had to happen quickly, and it had to happen at the end. There is one more thing wrong with stopping at climate, and it is the strongest objection of all. Warming on its own does not remove a woodland. It stresses it. It shifts what grows well and what struggles. Left alone, a stressed woodland is still a woodland. And a mammoth can still eat it. Climate cured the fuel. It did not light it. A loaded landscape is not an empty one. Something cleared 7 species out of Southern California in about 2 centuries. And the record of what that something was is not in the asphalt at all. It is at the bottom of a lake. Lake Elsinore lies inland, southeast of the basin, and it has been sitting there a very long time. At the end of a dry summer, smoke stands over the hills to the north. Ash drifts out across the water in a thin gray film, floats for a while, waterlogs, and sinks. On the lake bed, it settles into the mud, alongside everything else that fell that year, and the next year's mud covers it over. Do that for 33,000 years, and you have built an instrument. Researchers pulled about 100 vertical feet of that mud out of the lake bottom. A column of sediment taller than a 6-story building, holding roughly 33,000 years in order, bottom to top. Then they counted the flecks of charcoal at every level. A charcoal count is a fire record. More burning upwind, more black specks in that year's layer. It is a crude measurement, and it is very hard to argue with. The power of it is that it can be laid directly alongside the bonus funds. Both archives are dated by the same method, on the same scale. So the fire curve from the lake and the last appearance of each species in the asphalt can be put on one chart and read together. That is a rare thing in this science. Usually you have a cause in one place and an effect in another, separated by so much uncertainty that any story will fit. For most of that column, the signal is quiet. Before about 13,200 years ago, the cores show minimal fire activity. Southern California burned the way Southern California had always burned, sometimes locally and not much. Then the curve goes vertical. Charcoal accumulation rises roughly 30-fold. Not 30%, 30 times. And there is nothing remotely comparable anywhere in the preceding 33,000 years of the record. Now put the two archives side by side, because this is where the case comes together. The lake records the burning. The asphalt records who stopped walking. Two different deposits in two different places, measured by two different methods, describing the same event from opposite directions. What the fire did is what fire does to any landscape that has spent 1,000 years drying out. It took the woodland, and then it kept taking it. Oak and juniper cannot re-establish between burns that frequent. What comes back instead is chaparral, which burns well, recovers fast, and is built to do the whole thing again. The system flipped. Then it locked. That word matters. A landscape can absorb a great deal of damage and come back. What it cannot always come back from is a change that makes the damage self-sustaining. Chaparral burns more readily than woodland, and every burn makes the next one easier, so the new state defends itself. There is no gradual recovery afterwards, because the thing that would have to grow back is the thing the fires keep removing. A basin of chaparral can support an enormous amount of life. What it cannot support is a 9,000-kilogram animal that has to eat all day, or the herds that were feeding the cats. So how fast? And how complete? According to the fossil record, all of that devastation took barely 200 years. Of the 8 species tracked through the deposit, 7 are gone from the region by 12,900 years ago. The saber-toothed cat, the dire wolf, the American lion, the ground sloth, the horse, the bison, the camel. Every one of them had been in that basin since long before the record begins. Every one of them stops inside a window roughly as long as the United States has existed. There is a defendant most people would name at this point, and the dates rule it out. The Younger Dryas is a cold snap that begins about 12,900 years ago, a sharp return to near-glacial conditions. For decades, it has carried the blame for the end of the Ice Age giants, and one popular version blames a comet for setting it off. Whatever you make of the comet, the order of events does not work. The animals of Rancho La Brea were already gone when the cold arrived. This extinction is not a response to the Younger Dryas. It finishes just as the Younger Dryas is starting. For 100 years, the assumption ran the other way. The giants died as the Ice Age closed. The Ice Age closed with a violent climate event, so the climate event killed them. It was a reasonable order to assume in a period when nobody could date the bones tightly enough to check it. Once the bones carried dates, the order came apart. The killer had finished its work before the suspect walked into the room. One of the 8 comes through. The coyote, the smallest predator in the sample, the least specialized, the one that could live on rodents and fruit and whatever else the situation happened to offer. It is still in that basin now. It still crosses those roads at night, a few blocks from the pit its relatives are buried in. That is the pattern of this extinction in one animal. It did not select for strength or for weapons, or for the ability to bring down something enormous. It selected for not needing very much. Everything that required a large, reliable, specific landscape lost. The generalist walked through it. So the 5th suspect is the strongest one in the case. Fire is the mechanism. Fire is what physically emptied Southern California, in the sense that fire is what removed the food. But it cannot be the answer by itself, for a reason that is almost too simple to notice. Fire is an effect before it is a cause. Something has to keep lighting it. Drought dries the fuel. Drought does not strike a match 30 times more often than the previous 33,000 years managed. Lightning had been available that entire time. And lightning does not change its habits. So who did? One patch of ground in California recorded 50,000 years of Ice Age life, and then the record went empty. What emptied it? There is a second place in California where the same question can be asked, and it is a far cleaner experiment. Off the coast, west of what is now Santa Barbara, a single island stands out in the channel. Its name is Santa Rosa. It is larger than anything out there today, and it is shrinking. Every century the sea comes a little further up the slopes, and the ground the herds grazed a few generations ago is underwater. On that island, there were mammoths. Columbian mammoths had reached it at some point when the channel was narrow, most likely by swimming. And then, stuck on a finite island with a finite amount of food, they did what island populations of large animals reliably do. They got small. It is one of the most reliable rules in biology. Put a very large animal on an island, and over enough generations, its descendants shrink. A smaller body needs less food, survives a bad season on less reserve, and on an island there is nowhere to walk to when the food runs out. The pressure that would kill a 9-ton animal barely inconveniences a smaller one, and the island does the arithmetic for you, generation after generation. The result was the pygmy mammoth, about 1 3/4 meters at the shoulder, against more than 4 meters for its mainland ancestor. Around 760 kilograms against close to 9,000, 2/5 of the height. Under 1/10 of the weight. A mammoth you could look in the eye standing up. Their youngest remains date to about 13,000 years ago. By then, the island is being squeezed from both sides. Rising sea level is taking the low ground, and the conifer forest that fed them is breaking up as the climate warms. The island would not finally come apart into the 4 northern Channel Islands until the end of the Ice Age, thousands of years after the last dwarf mammoth. So what else turns up on that island at exactly that date? In 1959, 2 human thigh bones were found at a place called Arlington Springs on Santa Rosa Island. Radiocarbon dating in 1989 put them at roughly 13,000 years old, among the oldest human remains known anywhere in the Americas. Later examinations suggested the individual had been a woman. People and dwarf mammoths are on that island together, and then only the people are. It is worth being careful about what that does and does not prove. 2 dates that land in the same century are not a confession. Nobody has found a pygmy mammoth with a spear point in it. What the island gives you is something more useful than a smoking gun. It gives you a second, separate landscape with its own climate history and its own isolated population, where the arrival of people and the disappearance of the giant animal fall in the same narrow window. Once is a coincidence. Twice, in 2 places, with 2 different mechanisms available, starts to look like a pattern. Back on the mainland in the same window, the same signature shows up independently. Human numbers grow sharply, and they grow while the charcoal curve is climbing, in a landscape that 1,000 years of warming had already prepared. The picture most people carry at this point is a hunting picture. Spear points, drive lines, an industrial slaughter of the megafauna. That is not what this evidence shows. What it shows is quieter and much larger. A new ignition source arriving in a landscape that had spent 1,000 years curing. People set fire to ground on purpose. They burn to clear, to drive game, to bring on the plants they want. Every one of those fires is small. In wet woodland, every one of them goes out. Take away the drying, and the same people light the same fires and nothing happens. Take away the people, and the fuel simply sits there. So the sixth suspect is guilty, and only partly. Humans are the last link in this chain. They are not the chain. 6 suspects, 1 released, 5 partly guilty, and not one of them able to do this alone. So which of them emptied California? All of them, in order. Start with the bodies. These were animals that bred slowly and could not replace losses quickly, which meant they carried no margin for a bad century. Nothing about that was new. It had been true for as long as they had existed. Above them sat a predator guild so dense that the entire system was a standing bet on the herds holding steady. That density was not a warning sign at the time. It was the opposite. It was what a landscape looks like when it has been generous for a very long time. Then the climate turned. 1,000 years of warming, close to 6 degrees Celsius, cured the vegetation and thinned the browse, while never moving fast enough to kill anything on its own. Into that drying landscape came people, in growing numbers carrying fire as an ordinary tool. And from about 13,200 years ago, the charcoal in the lake goes up 30-fold and stays up. The woodland converts to chaparral, the food goes, and the animals that needed the most of it go first and go fastest. Barely 200 years and 7 of the 8 are gone. Nobody alive through it would have called it an extinction. 2 centuries is 6 or 7 generations of people. What you would have noticed, if you had been there for all of it, is that the fires came more often than your grandparents said they used to, that the big animals were further away than they had been, and then that they were only stories. That is the answer, and the shape of it matters as much as the content. There is no single killer here. Not the tar, not the cold, not the comet. Not even the hunters. Each link made the next one lethal. The warming made the fire possible. The people made the fire frequent. the fire made the basin uninhabitable for anything that large. And the great size that had carried these animals safely through every previous swing in the record was the exact quality that stopped them surviving this one. The only reason any of it can be read at all is that a patch of ground on Wilshire Boulevard happened to be leaking. It is still leaking. The oil still climbs the same fault out of the same drowned Miocene sea. The asphalt still goes soft above 18 degrees and still holds on to whatever walks into it. Pit 91 is still an open hole in the ground, and the crates lifted out of the car park are still being emptied a bucket at a time. Out of everything that ground has ever produced, exactly one of them was a person. And the coyote is still out there. There is something worth sitting with in that. The trap did not stop when the megafauna did. It has been running the whole time since, through everything that came afterwards, catching whatever the landscape happened to contain. For the last few thousand years, what it has been catching is a much smaller California. Perhaps the harder question is not what emptied California. It is what the same basin is being loaded with now. Warmer than it was, drier than it was, covered in the chaparral that the last fire regime installed, and carrying more ignitions from more people than anything in that 33,000-year record ever had to absorb. The tar pits are not a monument to a lost world. They are a set of measurements taken the last time this exact combination came together, left in the ground where anyone can go and check them. Thank you for watching Mystery Origins. There is more of the deep past buried under ordinary ground. And we will keep digging it up.